All right, so I'm here with Moshe Koppel, who's an Israeli and who uh, has interests in many topics that interest me, things like culture and also artificial intelligence. And I want to start with the artificial intelligence thing. First, Moshe, are you familiar with the story that came out somehow in the last week about this scroll, this Latin scroll?
Yes.
Okay, so you know more about archaeology and scrolls than I do. What's the significance of this? This
Okay.
is
I'll tell you about that. At some point, maybe I should introduce myself. But if
okay.
you want to dive right into the scrolls, that's fine too,
Yeah,
Arnold.
well, you will reveal yourself by your knowledge.
Okay, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, the story about the scrolls, which I only know about from the newspapers, but is that there were a number of scrolls that were found all scrunched up, basically. They're, from the days of Pompeii, and all scrunched up, and the idea was to try to read them. So there were two problems. I mean, one is that they're scrunched, and the other is that even if you could somehow manage to see the writing inside, you'd have to decipher it, which is very difficult. And these a group of I think kind of amateurs. I mean, this is what they do, but uh,
They're not chaired professors.
they're not chaired professors, no. And they did manage to figure out how to access the writing through, even though it was not a flat piece of papyrus from which they could easily read. And they were also able to put together, just the damaged pixels essentially, and managed to figure out what actually was said. They got a few thousand words out of it, and they won some big prize for it. So a lot of that involves AI, obviously. First of all, figuring out from this three-dimensional object what in fact are the where the pixels are, and secondly, putting them, trying to figure out what those words are. So they apparently, it's hard to get this from the popular press, but what I gather they did is that all the current, the newest technology like Chat GPT and some more obscure technology called BERT, all kind of what they're able to do is, given some context, figure out what the most likely word is that's missing, right? So they were able to leverage that kind of technology apparently, and put together a whole bunch of words.
Okay. And how does that relate to what your interests are and what you've tried to do with
Okay.
AI?
So I'll tell you, I was a professor of math and computers for, by the way, you can probably tell from my accent that I actually am American. I grew up in the States, did my doctorate there, did my postdoc at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and then I've been in Israel as a professor of math and computers for the past 40 something years. Recently retired. I have two think tanks, one of which we're not going to talk about because it involves constitutional issues that we're not talking about. And the other one is uses of AI for solving textual problems. I'm particularly interested in classical Hebrew texts, text going back from the Bible until today. So um, that's how it ties in. I'm interested in classical texts and figuring out one of the problems when you deal with old texts is they come from manuscripts, and there are a lot of mistakes creep in along the way. So somebody transcribes what they found in a manuscript, they make mistakes. Then some printer uses the transcription to put out a printed edition, and they make mistakes. And so forth. So one of the things that we try to do is to digitize classical texts, which are full of these mistakes, and you need to figure out, well, what is this word that doesn't seem to make any sense here? And you can use exactly that kind of AI technology in order to do it.
And have you been doing that, or have you been using sort of Chat GPT type stuff, or is that kind of a new way of doing it that you weren't
Well,
using before?
the ChatGPT kind of works with a similar technology to something called BERT, which preceded it, which came out of Google also about 7, 8 years ago. And the key to BERT is, it can kind of look at a text that's missing a word and say, I'll tell you what the word is. What ChatGPT does is like even more sophisticated than that. It says, let's start with a prompt. I'll tell you what the first word in the response ought to be. Now I'll tell you what the second word in the response ought to be. And then it just keeps going. And by some miracle, it's able to put together what looks like reasonable answers. Sometimes they hallucinate, but more or less, it's able to give you valuable information. So I'm actually, one of the projects that we're working on in my lab, which is called Dicta, is to build a large language model like GPT-4, but to start from scratch. So we're actually trying to do exactly what they did at GPT, but nobody can really compete with OpenAI. ChatGPT or GPT-4 has over 1 billion parameters in it. Okay, that's, in other words, you need to tune the way you build these things is by learning on a given text, and then you need to tune parameters. They're able to tune over 1 trillion parameters. Okay, the standard out in the world for people like me who put together LLMs and don't happen to have $10 billion to invest is 7 billion parameters, which is, obviously many orders of magnitude less. 7 billion would have, a couple of years ago sounded like a big number, but now that's an embarrassingly small number.
Are you
So
trying to do this for Hebrew or for
I'm doing
also?
this for Hebrew, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to do this for Hebrew, including classical Hebrew, that is ancient and medieval. The thing is,
It-
Hebrew was revived in the 20th century as a spoken language. Before that, it was used only for religious purposes. So if you look at all the Hebrew texts that we have, including Hebrew Aramaic, written in the Hebrew alphabet, from the Bible until today, you're talking a few billion words. I mean, if we really stretch, you could get to 10 billion words.
that
Uh,
includes all the modern stuff. I mean, like stuff that was written in the 1960s, or
so if you, it includes all the what I would call classical, medieval, and rabbinic modern texts. But if you
okay.
look at modern Hebrew texts that are, then we now have probably the biggest corpus in the world of Hebrew texts altogether, and you're talking about 30 something billion words. Okay, so this is also, it's probably 2 orders of magnitude less than what you can get in English, right? So OpenAI is probably using a corpus of over 1 trillion words. We're far away from that.
But are you using stuff from, I don't know what would the term be, contemporary Hebrew, or are you throwing that
Yes,
out and just
yes.
focusing on what,
No,
why
the
is
30
that, why
billion,
is
the
that
30 billion
useful?
word is contemporary Hebrew. Without, yeah, if you took all the classical Hebrew together, you might get to 10 billion words. So, which would not be enough to train a language model.
Really? But I just worry about polluting things. I mean, there's just,
Yeah,
um, I don't know. I mean, I'm just afraid that if you set up your
yeah.
chat and I wanted to do a chat with, Maimonides or something, he would end up talking about, iPhones or something.
Yes, you are inevitably going to pollute it, but bear in mind, just so you have an idea, when OpenAI trained GPT, they used 20 something different languages. Okay, they just threw it all in. They didn't even bother saying this is Hebrew, this is Greek. They just threw it all in there, and nothing terrible happened. So apparently you can do this.
Okay. And what are some of the goals that you're trying to get out of this? So sort of what research questions are you going to ask that, sort of a Hebrew scholar would ask?
Right. So one of the things that we're doing, and this isn't like our large language model, but let me maybe take a step back. If you look at these ancient texts, which many people are interested in reading, they're not very accessible. First of all, Hebrew lacks vowels. You know, when you write Hebrew, you don't put the vowels in. It's vowels are represented in Hebrew underneath the letters, and they're rarely used, right? So people have to kind of figure out what the vowels ought to be using context. There's also in classical text, there's no punctuation. You just keep going there. That you don't know where the question ends and the answer begins. This just makes it all more fun. And there are tons of abbreviations because they were trying to save ink and paper. So it's full of abbreviations that are all ambiguous. Um, so one of the things that we do using all of these tools is to make these old texts accessible to people by automatically putting in the vowels and automatically punctuating, automatically opening, you know, these abbreviations to show you what they stand for, identifying references because it wasn't considered plagiarism in classical texts to quote from previous things without necessarily identifying exactly where it was from. People were kind of supposed to know. They're supposed to recognize these, you know, these quotes and texts. So all this we can now do automatically, but we are trying to get exactly what you hinted at before. I'd like to converse with Maimonides. So one of the things I want to do is actually ask the kind of question you might have asked Maimonides and see if we can synthesize the answer that he would have given.
Okay. What about things like trying to determine authorship of different things?
So that was the subject of much of my research before I even started on this particular project. There are lots of classical texts that we don't know who wrote them. Sometimes it's somebody obscure and we'll never know, but sometimes it's somebody famous whose name isn't on it, and scholars have all kinds of fun arguments about this. You know, one says, "Oh, this must have been written by so and so," and other people say, "No, it must have been." And you can use all kinds of interesting machine learning techniques, essentially, to divine an author's writing style, and then you can, you know, once you've divined the writing style, you can say, "Oh, this must belong. This must have been written by so and so." So there's a lot of very interesting problems of that nature.
Okay. Um, Anything else you would want to say on that topic, on the topic of AI and these ancient texts? Are you trying to decipher things that haven't been deciphered before that archaeologists have come up with?
We haven't worked on that because the problem of identifying, let's put it this way, what we have been working with so far are very old printed texts. Uh, Trying to decipher manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts, is a different problem that some of my colleagues are working on. I've been steering clear of that, although they're not fundamentally different problems, but I haven't been working on that.
Okay. Um, okay, then I make a sharp turn to this question of culture. Um, the so um, you know, recently in I think it was the Financial Times, a guy put together some uh, striking charts saying that there's been a big divergence among young people, and that young women are lurching to the left and young men are drifting to the right. And I've been reading more recently, some people are questioning whether he's overstating that trend, but I mean, there is some divergence, and there's a question of whether maybe he's overstating it. First of all, how does that look to you? I mean, let's ignore Israel for the moment. How does that look to you, you know, looking at the West? What does it seem, first of all, plausible? And second of all, what would you say about it, if it
Okay,
is?
so yeah, I've been following the debates online about that, and it does seem that there are some questions about this in the United States because there are other sources of data available about people's political opinions in the United States, and they don't seem to hold up the results that were in that article. But that's only the United States. I mean, you know, that Financial Times article had examples from a whole bunch of countries. What I found interesting about them was that in every country that they looked at, with the exception of South Korea, where you had men actually becoming more conservative and women becoming more progressive, in the other countries, everybody was becoming more progressive. This is only about young people, right? It's about people in their 20s. The young people were uniformly becoming more progressive. It's just that the women were becoming more progressive at a faster rate than the men were. So that's a very interesting thing. Um, um, if I might turn to Israel, though, now
Okay.
the interesting thing about Israel is not just that we don't find any divergence between men and women, but that young people in Israel are actually considerably more conservative than older people in Israel. That's what's really striking. It makes Israel an oddity.
Okay, I have a couple questions about that. Let me throw them out there so I don't forget them. One is that, does that conservatism, definitely precede October 6th and sort of, or if it was affected by that? Um, and the second is sort of what happens when you slice through various demographics? Because I think in the United States, if you, for example, do more than just slice by age and gender, but slice by education, you get an even more dramatic shift, the college educated versus not college educated. I think if you slice by urban rural, you also, get more of a divergence. So in Israel, I mean, I think some natural slices are between sort of Jews with European ancestry and Jews of Middle Eastern ancestry, Russian Jews. So anyway, if you do those kinds of slices, do you have a sense of how things?
The answer is I'm not quite sure, but let me throw a few data points at you, and then let's start talking anecdotally, which is actually more fun.
Okay.
Less reliable, but more fun. So what the pollsters have been showing for a number of years now is that if you just ask people to self-identify as being conservative, centrist, or progressive, 60% of young people identify as, let's just call it right wing. Okay, I think they say right, left, or center. 60% of young Israelis identify as right wing. If you ask people that when I say young, I mean from 18 to 30, 18 to 29. If you ask people who are 60 and above, if they identify as right, center, or left, only 45% say that they're right wing. Okay, so there's a big gap between older people and younger people in how they self-identify. So to your question, all of the studies show that this correlates with religiosity, ethnicity, and other stuff like that. Okay, so roughly speaking, Israel is about divided evenly between people who came from European or Christian countries and people who came from North African, Middle Eastern, Muslim countries, right? Israel is a country of immigrants. Most of the immigrants came with the founding of Israel in 1948, but they continue to come. And all of these things, right? These used to be different axes along which you could divide people. There was the ethnic one, there was the religious one, there was socioeconomic one. And now all of these things have kind of aligned. Okay, what you have in Israel now is essentially a single axis where on, let's call it the right pole of the axis, you have people who are more religious, tend to come from Islamic countries, what we call here Sfaradim, as opposed to Ashkenazim, who are the ones who came from Christian or European countries. all of these things kind of more or less align on a single axis, okay? So we can just call it right to left. Um, now, here's the thing, if, the question you asked me about men and women, right? It turns out there isn't much of a difference between men and women's political views, whether they're right wing or they're left wing. There is at the long tail, okay, you have got a normal distribution along this right left axis. If you look at the tails, if you look at the parties, now, first of all, just a bit of background. Israel has a party system. It's completely proportional. There are no regions. There's no first past the post in a district. Everybody in the country is in the same district, and the Knesset, which consists of 120 members, which is Israel's parliament, is totally proportional. Okay, so what you find is, and therefore we have a whole bunch of parties, about a dozen different parties, okay, and that are represented. The parties at the extreme left, that is the 10% most left parties, 2/3 of their voters are women. If you look at the parties that are the 10% most right-wing parties in Israel, 2/3 of their voters are men. Okay, so you definitely have that divide. But when you look at the overall picture, there's not much difference between men and women, right? One doesn't find much of a difference at all. So that's more or less the statistical story, but the anecdotal story is much more interesting. You want to prod?
Well, so how deep is, let's say, the divide between secular and, let's say, pre-October 7th? Because a lot of things may have changed.
Right.
How deep was the divide between sort of secular and religious Israelis? I mean, sort of Tel Aviv versus Jerusalem.
Right. So the answer is that if you were reading the newspapers and watching the most extreme incidents that were taking place, you'd have thought that this was a country in which religious and secular, right and left, are at war with each other. There was, on the day, October 7th, the day that the Hamas attack took place and precipitated the war, was a Jewish holiday called Simchat Torah. Now, that's a day when it's customary to have big celebrations. People carry the Torah scroll around with them and dance with it and so forth. And some people in Tel Aviv, which is a more secular city, had planned to have public dancing in a public square with the Torah. And some radical secularists said that they don't want to see any kind of religious displays in public, and they were going to break this up. They were going to come in and bust it up and not let it happen. And the whole country was in kind of a panic as what was going to happen. And what happened was that we got an actual war instead of this little silly civil war that people were threatening each other with. So it looked like it was really bad. But what we quickly discovered on October 7th was that it was a very, very small group of radicals that were fighting, and basically the rest of the country didn't see it that way at all. I can tell you that my son and son-in-law have been fighting in Gaza for the last months, right? They're in combat unit. Basically, every Israeli between the ages of 18 and 40 was called into the reserves to fight this war. So every family has somebody who went off to war. They're all there together, religious and secular, left and right. Everybody's fighting together. And every single soldier you speak to will tell you the exact same thing. None of us have had a single, we've been living together for 4 months, right, in these tight quarters. Not once has anybody made a cynical comment, a sarcastic comment, anything that would suggest that there's some kind of disagreement about religion or politics. It's just off the table. It's just a bunch of old people basically arguing, people who are too old to be drafted that are arguing. And those are the ones who were arguing even before the war. That's just it seems that there's a small group of people who just love to argue.
Okay.
But that's not where the
And
country's at anymore.
and so how do you think the politics have changed, let's say now versus like for example, if an election were held now,
Right.
which parties would gain and which parties would lose?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question because here's what happened. Um, the ruling coalition until October 7th was a right-wing coalition. It tended religious or traditional. It combined a bunch of parties, but they tended to be more right-wing and more religious. That was the coalition. And if you ask people, which many pollsters I know personally did, they said, well, have your opinion since October 7th, since the Hamas attack, become more right-wing or more left-wing? Nobody became more left-wing. That wasn't the kind of incident that drives people to the left. Uh, Many people say that they've become more right-wing. But then when you follow that up and say, well, who are you going to vote for? People are so angry that the coalition, the ruling coalition, failed in anticipating this war and preparing for this war that they say they're going to vote for opposition parties, right? So the left-wing opposition is actually much stronger in the polls than the right-wing coalition, even though people have moved to the right, which is bizarre. But what it suggests is that the ones who have a good chance of cleaning up here are people who are right wing, but not in the coalition, which means essentially a new party. Israelis love new parties, by the way. Every
Yeah.
election, every time there's an election, there's another party that comes in that, was just created. Nobody knows what they really think. They get, 7 or 8 or 10 seats. This time, if a new right-wing party dives into the fray, they could get 25 seats out of 120.
Is is that someone like a Bennett or just somebody that's never been heard of? Just a Yelet Shaked or somebody like that?
Yeah, so that one of the people who is going to try to jump in there is Naftali Bennett. For those who are unfamiliar, Naftali Bennett was a young Turk on the right who started his own party that was moderately successful. And then with only 6 seats out of 120, he had a small party, managed to make a coalition with the left in the previous government. And it lasted a year. Then there was a new election and there was a right-wing coalition came in. But Naftali Bennett is now regarded as personally right-wing, but having made a coalition with the left, which angered the right, he now has very few friends left. The left regards him as a right-winger. The right regards him as a traitor who made a government with the left. So he sits somewhere in the middle. He is either going to just be wiped out because nobody likes him anymore, or he's going to be that guy, right? He went home. He hasn't been involved in politics for the past year and a half. He might clean up. He might fail completely.
Okay.
It's
So back sort of outside of Israel, what do you make of what's going on in the West? Does it look sort of unsustainable to you?
It does. I don't know what the political views of people who were here with me are, and I don't want to.
They're going to be uh, kind of somewhere between libertarian and conservative. So you
Okay.
know,
So the answer is, look, I have a think tank that does politics, the one we're not talking about, and it defines itself literally as conservative libertarian. Okay, so I speak 2 of the languages, Arnold, that you've outlined. Okay, the one I don't speak is the progressive one. I speak conservative and I speak libertarian, and to me, from here, sitting 6,000 miles away as a former American, it just looks like everybody in the United States has gone out of their minds. I don't know how it looks when you're actually in the United States, but to me, it just looks like everybody went crazy. The hearings of those, three college presidents in Congress, that was just astonishing to me. Was it as astonishing to you as it was to me?
I would say, oh, no, only because I'd seen it coming, right? What has been going on, I don't know when I first noticed it. I know I wrote a blog post years ago where I said, this country's going at some point going to vomit up this alien thing that it swallowed, which I couldn't even put a name to at that point. Um, so that's so I'm still waiting for that kind of thing to happen, but it may be in the process of happening. Um, uh,
Okay,
so that I mean, I think there are several viewpoints on this. One is that uh, it's just a small minority of people who have this kind of, you know, diehard oppressor oppressed framing. Uh, and another view is, oh no, they've taken over all the institutions. This country's going down the tubes. And another view is that it'll pass. It's past its peak. Um, I could make a case for any one of those actually. But anyway, my view of college professors, I've written this, is it's a job for a spineless bureaucrat, and they're going to respond to where the pressure points are, and all their pressure points have been coming from the left, and what's new is for them to face pressure points from the right, and that all of a sudden the donors woke up. They woke up a sleeping giant in the donors with that performance. Uh, so, but they still face a very threatening, menacing uh, constituency among their administrators, especially their DEI administrators, but these colleges are just rife with administrators, with their faculty, because there's a big proportion of just very radical faculty, including in the so-called studies fields.
right,
So but one of the interesting things, if there is this male-female divide, and we also read that people care much more about the politics of their potential mate than they used to.
right,
And we already probably have an imbalance of uh, many more female college graduates than male. Are we just going to have a bunch of unmarried people
right.
going on?
That is a great concern. I'll tell you something anecdotal. We said we weren't going to talk about the Israel's constitutional crisis, but I will make indirect reference to it for the purpose of this anecdote. The story is what we're not talking about is that my think tank led an effort for some judicial reform in the past year. The courts in Israel are very activist, and we had a coalition that was right wing. So basically, left wingers wanted to give as much power as possible to the courts, whereas right wingers wanted to give as much possible power to the parliament, to the Knesset. And the Knesset proposed a whole bunch of reforms, which were based on research that had been done in my think tank, basically to make Israel more similar to the United States in many ways, in terms of the balance of powers. And this began a series of very, very angry demonstrations. They were getting every Saturday night, there were demonstrations in Tel Aviv, which is the secular city, against this proposed reform of over 100,000 people, at least according to the organizers' accounts. And I undertook to speak to people who were opposed to reform to see if I could understand what the problem was and if we could find a compromise that would allow some reform, but that wouldn't set the country on fire. And the interesting thing that I found was that when I spoke to younger people, their arguments were more or less very pragmatic. They said, "Look, we think this part of the reform is too much. Let's, And I was able to get to some kind of agreements with them. But when I spoke to older people, that was impossible. And the reason for that has a lot to do with the history of Israel. Israel began as a secular socialist country. In a sense, it was a revolt against the old Jewish community leaders in the abroad who was seen as being too religious and too conservative, and a younger generation of people who were secular and socialist were going to start a secular socialist country in Israel. And these people who started the country are now old, and they see this right-wing kind of traditionalist coalition as having stolen their country from them. So when I would talk to them and say, well, can we compromise? They literally would say to me, no, there's nothing to talk about. This government just needs to disappear and all its ideas need to go away because they've stolen our country, right? So whereas in the United States, one might think of the Republicans as being, the old establishment or something, and, in Israel, it's the left wing that's the old establishment. So that when that might account for the fact that young people now are more right wing, it's kind of rebellious against the old establishment in a way to be right wing, right? So Israel's got a very different history than the United States.
Yeah, in the United States, it's I think as of now, the elites are more on the left, and and the Republicans are are in such a rebellious mode that people kind of wonder whether they're able to govern.
Right.
So it's a weird situation. Okay, I think I want to open it up. We usually get questions that are better than mine, even from the audience. So if people have been thinking of them, feel like raising a virtual hand or uh, going on screen and raising a real hand. Okay, let's let Lee go ahead. Let me see if I have to do anything. Okay, you have to unmute, Lee. There you go.
Yep. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Moshe, thanks for that. Arnold, thanks. At the beginning of the call, we were talking about some of your work in understanding authorship of texts. And I recently had watched a show called Manhunt, which is about the FBI guys who used linguistic forensics, they called it, to try to figure out who the Unabomber was, and that they were able to match his manifesto to his dissertation and then develop some certainty that it was him. And I was curious if that field has advanced along with the advent of AI, and if that's something where, like, you could now ascertain authorship very quickly of a modern text just by feeding in certain types of content.
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes. As a matter of fact, I've published dozens of articles exactly on that. Machine learning, which is now the leading part of AI, does exactly that. So what you're able to do is take a bunch of texts by various suspects, somehow learn the differences between their writing style and the other suspects, and then take a document and see whether it's more similar to one or the other. That's exactly what we do. The problem is that in most of these forensic cases, The problem is not quite as simple as that, right? In a perfect world, you have some number of actual suspects. You know that, or you assume that the actual perpetrator, as the case may be, is one of those suspects, and then it's pretty easy, right? You say, well, let's just see what distinguishes each one from the rest. In the real world, that's not what actually happens. Okay, what really happens in the real world is that you've got one or two suspects, but it could be anybody, right? So that you have very little reason to believe that the actual perpetrator is even one of your suspects, right? So, and that's a much harder problem, right? The question now is not which one of these suspects is the perpetrator, but rather, is this particular suspect the perpetrator or not? So it's really the suspect against the rest of the world, where you don't know the rest of the world, right? It's not a specified rest of the world. And that's called authorship verification. Authorship verification is a much, much harder problem to solve than authorship attribution, where you have a small closed set of suspects. Um, so if you're an academic in this field, as I am, and you see practitioners talking about real live cases in court, you've got to be a snob about it and go, no, I'm sorry, but what you're doing is, that just isn't legit, because that's not the kind of stuff that we've solved in the lab, but so the answer is yes. AI has provided us with tremendous tools, but in the end, the real world problems are significantly harder than the ones that we solve in academic papers.
Okay. So there,
All right, thank you.
So there are a couple of questions in chat about sort of what it's like for Israeli conservatives versus American conservatives. So one question is, in what respects do they maybe differ? And another question is, do conservatives feel much more comfortable on an Israeli campus than they would in an American campus?
Okay, so that's a great question. So the answer to the first question is that the kinds of issues that distinguish the right from the left in Israel are not exactly the same ones that distinguish the right from the left in the United States. So, for example, abortion has always been, one of the hot button issues that will distinguish the right from the left. In Israel, it's a complete non-issue. I have literally, right, I run a conservative libertarian think tank. Abortion would be exactly the kind of issue that would be a scissor issue for me, because, well, libertarians might have different views on it than conservatives. It has never come up. Nobody in Israel argues about abortion. The government has had a policy for many, many years that essentially is fairly liberal on abortion, but takes into account several parameters. How what is the stage of the pregnancy? What is the urgency in terms of the health of the mother, etc. And nobody argues about this stuff at all, right? So most of the kind of issues of social conservatism are not hot button issues in Israel. The hot button issues in Israel tend, for reasons that will not surprise you, revolve mostly around security kind of stuff, because we have real security issues to deal with over here. That would be the number one issue between the right and the left, which in the United States is obviously much less significant. I mean, there is some overlap issues. We have a problem of illegal immigration, just like the United States has an issue of illegal immigration. So that's the kind of thing that people do talk about. Most of the issues kind of fall under the rubric of religious secular issues, right? So that kind of covers a lot. So I would say it's about 70% security issues, 30% religious secular issues, and nothing else matters much here.
And on campus, are conservative students a thing, or?
So in Israel, because younger people are not as uniformly progressive as they are in the United States, in fact, the majority of young people are conservative. Maybe with students, it's a little bit different. Maybe for students, the majority is still progressive, but it's not so progressive that a conservative would feel uncomfortable on campus.
Okay. And any comments on sort of where the Arab Israelis stand, the ones who are citizens, they fit in with something?
Okay, so that's about 20% of the population, and that's kind of a sensitive question. One of the differences that you have for minorities in Israel as opposed to minorities in other countries such as the United States is because we don't have a two-party system, right? We have a proportional system. There are actual Arab parties, and the majority, not all, but the majority of Arab citizens of Israel vote for Arab parties. There are two main Arab parties. There used to be many more, but there's the threshold for getting into the Knesset was raised from 1% to 3% or 3.25%. And when they raised the threshold, all these small parties ended up having to form unified parties so that they would get past the threshold. So there are now two main Arab parties, one of which is more moderate, though with a religious tinge, and the other one of which is a coalition of people who are more radical, either as a pan-Arabic party. It's a combination of a pan-Arabic party and a very religious Islamist party and a communist party, right? So they all combined into a single one. So the Arabs here basically have not much influenced the other parties because most of the Arabs vote for these separate Arab parties who generally, if they're not in the coalition, but at least they will generally align with the left wing in Israel as opposed to the right wing, which in some ways is interesting because the parties that identify more with Islam tend to be conservative in their social views. But because social conservatism is less of an issue here than security issues, they will always go with the left.
Okay, Dennis, let me see if I can have you unmute and have your question.
Okay, I'm very interested in the work you're doing with the ancient texts. We know there's been, centuries of work, certainly going back to the Germans in the 19th century and going up through people like Emmanuel Tov in the current era. And I'm just curious to get your sense of what you think you're likely to learn that has not been discerned by all of these meticulous scholars over the years.
Right. That's a very, very interesting question. So your reference to the German scholars of the 19th century and Emmanuel Tov, just for those who aren't familiar, is about higher biblical criticism, right? So according to tradition, the Pentateuch, the five books of Moses, are a unified work, whereas according to Bible scholars, beginning with the German scholars Wellhausen and others in the 19th century, and continuing with people like Emmanuel Tov, who are contemporary scholars, suggest that there are four different sources for the Bible, that it's a combination of four different works. So we've actually used machine learning techniques to try to challenge or confirm the conclusions of those scholars. What we found when we did this is that the Deuteronomy, which is one of the four, which is one of the five books of Moses, and which is regarded as a separate source, in fact, it looks very different. I mean, even to the naked eye, one doesn't need to use any sophisticated techniques to see that it's different. The question is, in the first four books, the scholars divided into three different types. They call them J, E, and P, the priestly, and then the non-priestly divides into the J and the E, which are two different ways of referring to God, right? The four-letter name of God and Elohim, which is a more generic reference to a divine being. And we actually used machine learning techniques to try to find the optimal division of the Bible, of the first 4 works of the Bible, into 2 and into 3 parts. What we found was that if you use machine learning techniques to divide the first 4 books optimally into 2 parts, you exactly reconstruct the division into priestly and non-priestly. That the scholars already in the 19th century, it's evolved since then, but you pretty much get the same division. But if you try to divide the non-priestly into 2 parts, the J and the E, you get nothing that looks anything like the scholarly consensus on that. So make of that what you will.
Okay, Tom, did you still have a question? Okay, let me go ahead and you have to unmute. There you go.
I tried unmuting. Thanks. I had a question on your machine learning, but with respect to education. And it's my contention that one of the most likely first products for good AI-based tutoring would be English language tutoring. You might know that throughout the world, more people pay for learning English than they pay for almost anything else. And certainly more than paying for learning any other language, or in fact, all other languages combined. Are you aware of some Israeli organizations that are doing English or Hebrew teaching or Arabic teaching? That's the first part of the question. And the second part, which is related, is I wrote up a conservative libertarian idea that Israel should occupy Gaza and create a Swiss-style Singapore of 5 cantons and support 29 of the 30 UN articles of human rights, excluding the self-determination one, but make it secular so it would be non-Jewish and non-Muslim and non-Christian, just open secular. And as part of that speculative thing, I suggested that the Israeli occupiers teach everybody English. And so I'd like your comments on those ideas.
Thanks, Tom. That is an awful lot to cover, and I can only get myself in trouble by actually answering the question.
That's why Arnold only asks me in the last couple of minutes.
It's an interesting thing about how AI is going to affect people's desire to learn English. It actually has 2 contradictory effects. Okay, on the one hand, there's so much going on in English that people all over the world are incentivized to learn English, right? I mean, English has so many more resources than any other language. But on the other hand, one of the byproducts of all of this interesting AI work recently is the ability to translate quickly, even into obscure languages, so that people can be speaking to you in English and you could actually instantaneously be hearing them in Hungarian or whatever language it is that you speak that might be much more obscure than Hungarian. So these things are actually working against each other, and it's not clear how it's going to play out at the end. It may very well be that people won't need to learn English because translation is so effective and instantaneous. So I'm not sure about that.
Okay, I'm going to actually stop the recording.